Hey friends, welcome back to Heretical Hippies, where Anna and Carrie Jo wander back into the wreckage of their deconstruction to see if they can offer hope to anyone else who might be climbing out of the dust and ashes of their faith. Buckle up, it's about to get real. Hey, beautiful people. It's Carrie Jo and Anna here. We have our good friend Clint Heacock. We are continuing part 2 of a conversation that we started on Clint's podcast, which is called Dismantling Doctrine. And if you didn't check that out, I would encourage you to go there first, listen to that, give the show a like, a follow, and then come back here and go to part 2, which is this conversation that will ensue. So Anna and Clint, thanks for being here.
Yeah, looking forward to another conversation.
Yes. Yeah, we could. I feel like we could talk for hours and hours. So it's good we have a time frame. Keep us on track. Clint, so if you listen to part 1, you realize that Clint was a pastor. He was raised in a fundamental, very conservative type of Christianity. If you don't mind kind of fleshing that out a little bit more, where you were, and maybe quickly bring us up to where you are today.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting because this is the subject of a book that I'm hoping will be coming out soon. I've been working with a good friend of mine. He's helping me edit it. It's in the final editing stages. And it's basically that story. It talks about how I was raised in the Church of Christ in the Seattle, Washington area. This would have been early 1970s through the 80s, kind of this time period of my life. I was baptized not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Ooh,
twice
superstar.
Twice as a kid, yeah. Because I was so desperate to get it right. I was fueled with this rapture anxiety because when I was a kid growing up in this fundamentalist church in the early, mid-1970s, they showed that movie, A Thief in the Night, at a Sunday evening service. And I talk about in the book about how this gave me such rapture anxiety. I was so afraid at 10 years old that Jesus was going to return suddenly and I would be left behind, just like the people in the film. And so I went to the pastor and I said, I need to become a Christian. I do not want to be left behind if the rapture happens. And the answer was, you need to get baptized because in the Church of Christ tradition, salvation equates just getting baptized. So I got baptized at 10, but of course nothing happened other than me getting wet. But I was convinced I was a Christian, so I tried my hardest for 3 years and failed miserably. So at 13, I went to the next pastor who had replaced the last one, our new pastor, and he basically said, well, the first baptism didn't take for some reason. We don't know what happened. We're not going to disparage a good man, for getting it wrong, but clearly we need to get you baptized again. So that was the answer. So that was kind of the cycle. I was so desperate to get it right and so afraid that I was going to miss the rapture and lose out, and be left behind and all that. That drove me for years and years and years, that rapture anxiety, that religious trauma syndrome. And then I went to Bible college, I went to seminary. And I think looking back on it now, a lot of it was to try to find answers to the problems that I had as a kid, as a young man, those struggles and issues with theology and the Bible, because I wanted to not only find out the answers for myself, but I wanted to be in a position to be able to help others as a pastor. So that's why that was a big part of the motivation, I think, that drove me for years. I was a pastor for about 12 years in the Portland, Oregon area. Then I went to Bible college and seminary in Portland. Then I came over here to the UK about 18, 19 years ago, did a PhD, taught at a Bible college for another 8 years. So I was all in 100% for most of my adult life.
Oh, that is fascinating. You sound like you're quite the scholar. You've done a lot of continuing education. I'm curious at what point in your education that you started to question this concept of the rapture, given that the rapture anxiety played such a huge role in you coming to faith. At what point did you notice that start to unravel?
When I started studying it in Bible college, I think I even had an assignment in an eschatology class. If people don't know what the word eschatology means, it's a theological term. It means the study of the end times, study of the last days, and all the prophecies in books like Revelation and Daniel and other places like that talk about the coming of the end and all this, the Antichrist and the beast and, the final war and Armageddon and all this stuff. But as I studied it, I began to realize that there were other Christians from other traditions that believed very, very different views of the end times. You have certain people that believe that the rapture is going to occur before. There's supposed to be 7 years of tribulation. Some people think it's going to be in the middle. Some people think it's going to be the end. Some people say, no, there won't be any tribulation. So some people think it's after 1,000-year reign of Christ. And these people will argue vehemently their point of view that they're right and all the others are heretical. So when I started studying, I thought, wait a minute, I'm just coming from one tradition of many. And yet I was convinced as a kid, because I was in this bubble, that it was all true. I wasn't exposed to those other points of view. And so I thought, wait a minute, I was manipulated on some level here, that I wasn't exposed to other interpretations of the Bible.
Right. And it's interesting because you mentioned, so you discovered that other people have different beliefs. And I imagine that would create a lot of cognitive dissonance for you, which we also talked about in part 1 of this conversation, and how the death by 1,000 paper cuts, the cognitive dissonant moments, how they add up. Would you say you encountered those moments more in your educational years, or can you look back on, when you were 10 and got baptized and it didn't take, so to speak, can you look back on your early Christian days and also see a lot of cognitive dissonance that existed? Maybe you just weren't able to identify it because of, emotional maturity at that time.
That's it. And the lack of context, the lack of perspective, because every Christian I knew struggled with their faith. They had doubts, they had questions, especially when real tough times come into your life, suffering, a loved one dies, a horrible thing happens financially, or you're struggling, or whatever it might be. And you start to question, wait a minute, why is God allowing this to happen in my life? We've prayed, we talked about this in the other half, we prayed for someone who was dying of cancer and they didn't get healed, they died anyway. Why, these questions. That's some of the times I think when people really start to question, wait a minute, I'm not sure I believe this. But every time I had those doubts and questions, somebody would talk me down from the cliff, as it were. I was going to jump and sack it all in. But a mature Christian, quote unquote, some person that I looked up to, a pastor, or someone who was discipling, I would go to them and say, hey, look, I'm struggling. And they would give me some answers. We talked about this in our episode before. Even the best one is, you're not going to find out until you get to heaven. There's no answer that's better than that one. So that would quell the cognitive dissonance for the time being. But now, as you say, I look back on it and think, oh my God, it was thousands and thousands of those little micro hits that eventually was found wanting, and I just couldn't sustain it anymore. The mental shelf collapsed and I just couldn't do it anymore.
Do you remember was there a specific subject or question that you were struggling with that was the final straw for you?
Well, I remember you said, Carrie Jo, I think when you were struggling and deconstructing, one of the things was the political stuff that was going on in the States around the 2015, 2016 election. I really had a hard time when I started seeing white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump. And I thought, how come they can't see through this guy? I mean, he's a fraud. He's a serial liar. He's an abuser of women, misogynist, racist, and all the rest of it. Then I said the same thing I think you did, Carrie. I did not want to be considered an evangelical anymore. I was still a Christian, a progressive one. So there were those kind of things. But when I was doing my doctoral studies, I actually did a study on the book of Ezekiel, the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. And I was an Old Testament scholar. And I found that the God of that book was not a God that I wanted to serve. And that was one of my final straws. I had a lot of other issues and questions before that. But there's one passage in the book of Ezekiel where he's in exile in Babylon along with the other exiles. And he's supposed to be warning them that God's going to destroy Jerusalem and all this. And at one point, God comes to Ezekiel. This is just in the narrative of the book. And he says to Ezekiel, basically, I'm going to kill your wife tomorrow, and you will not be allowed to mourn for her, as an object lesson to your fellow exiles. And when I kill your wife, you're not going to be able to cry or weep or shed a tear. And that's what happens, according to the narrative. God kills Ezekiel's wife, and he's done nothing wrong. All he's done is faithfully obey God as a prophet and try to do every ridiculous thing God told him to do. And he kills his wife. And I'm like, what the hell? I never saw that before. How can I go to church on Sunday and worship that God and pray to that God and praise that God? If that's the God of the Bible, that's a cruel, capricious deity that I do not want to serve any longer. And that was one of the big moments I can point to and say, I have a huge problem with this quote unquote God of the Bible. If that's the true God, there's no way. And then you start getting into the genocide and all the other stuff in the Old Testament, and some of the teachings of Jesus are quite problematic. And I'm like, wait a minute. I can't serve this God. No way. I'm not going to. And these Christians, I would look around the church on a Sunday and they're worshiping and praying and thinking, have you read the Bible? Have you read those passages like Ezekiel where God does that to somebody who's a faithful servant, or the book of Job?
Right.
Good God, I could not do it. I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah. And then a lot of the praise choruses, that are real popular. One of my least favorites, or one of my favorites to hate, is the God, you're never gonna let me down. They just you just keep repeating it over and over and over. And I remember singing this is before I started deconstructing. I remember singing that and thinking, what the hell God is this that you're singing about? Because that has not been my experience.
Which God?
Yes. And
the God of the Bible?
But that's just another example, I think, of almost gaslighting ourselves, to try to make it okay that we're here on this Sunday and worshiping this God. So in deconstruction, Anna and I have talked about this on other episodes of our own, and I know you have too on a lot of interviews that you've done with people, Clint. But I know that you've created a spectrum of deconstruction based on some of the research you've done. And I would love it if you could take us through that process of creating it. How'd you come up with the answers that you got? And if you don't mind giving kind of a brief summary of those phases.
Yeah, there's actually an article that I wrote. It's on Medium. People can find it. It's called What Happens When People Leave the Church. I think that's what it's called. And I've actually given presentations at different conferences on that because it's been such a long lasting sort of article. But basically, I was part of years ago when I first came out as an ex-evangelical, I was part of a Facebook group that was sort of an ex-evangelical support group. And I've since left that, but it was really helpful for my deconstruction because I realized there was thousands of other people that were doing the same thing I was doing on this journey. And you think, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one doing this. And I started asking questions in the group and saying, what did you do after you left the church, after you left the faith? And I found there was this spectrum of responses. So what I did, I started sort of categorizing them. And I think I came up with about 15 or 16 different responses. And what's fascinating is that people will start down one path and then they'll switch to another position and another position. And it's not about like right or wrong, like, oh, I found the right one. It's some people go down the road of the progressive Christian. They think, okay, I can't believe the fundamentalist version. I'll jettison some of the harsher teachings of the Bible. I'll jettison hell. I'll become more of a universalist. I'll become more liberal. And then you go all the way down to the other end of the spectrum and you're an angry atheist. You're an angry, and so, but you'll find, I think people will bounce from point to point. And I could see my own journey on that spectrum. I did the progressive Christian thing for a while. I was very angry though. I became an angry agnostic, very angry at the quote God of the Bible. Now I feel like I've dealt with that anger and I'm more reconstructing. So, it's a fascinating journey. It really is. It's a helpful article, I think, for people who've left the church and kind of going, okay, where am I? I need it. Oh, I went from 1 to 7 to 12, and that's kind of where I'm at now, but I might be somewhere else along this thing in a couple of years.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful too, to normalize that, like you said, to not feel alone, to realize, oh, okay, it is okay to feel this way. It is okay to be experiencing my anger phase. It's just part of it. And to acknowledge that and let people know, you're doing great. You're doing okay. Keep going. Yeah. I think we would love to include access to that article in the show notes. So
yeah, I can send you the link to it.
We will definitely include a link to that because I think that will be useful for people, because we have people in our audience all over the place, as I'm sure you do as well. Some are still Christians. Some are maybe entering deconstruction very new. They're in that really chaotic, discombobulated world. And to know that their experiences are not unique to them is going to be really helpful.
It is helpful because it's like I said, it's not about right or wrong or one position is better than the other. But the overwhelming feedback I get when people read the article or when I've presented it at conferences, I did one on conference on death, grief, and belief. My good friend, Dr. Terry Daniel, who's been on my show a few times, she and I have talked about it, and we did this thing for her conference, and the feedback afterwards was kind of what you said, where people were saying, okay, that is so helpful just to kind of chart it out. I can see my journey. I can see where I've been, and I've seen the steps I've taken, and it's different for everybody. It's not the same for everyone, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've really appreciated about my relationship with Carrie Jo is just her ability to let me be where I'm at. And I guess in a way, me also doing that for her and just accepting each other in our own process. And that's not something you get when, we're so used to being judged, so used to being under scrutiny and wanting to please. I mean, if there's ever, people pleasing is just so encouraged in the church,
Yep.
because what will so-and-so think, and what will so-and-so think, and you can't do that because so-and-so might see you. Like,
it's exhausting. Well, and that's one of the, I know we mentioned this when we talked the other day before we started recording, but when I started studying the cult psychology and applying those to evangelicalism, my experiences and the experiences of other people, the most helpful one was Dr. Robert J. Lifton's. He has 8 markers of cults from his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And what I find fascinating about Lifton is not only does he describe the 8 markers of cults, but he also describes the psychological effect of each one on us. And the 2 that come to mind right now are the demand for purity and the cult of confession. And that's what you're just saying, I think, is that within evangelicalism and cults as well, there's this demand for this incredibly high standard of purity, whatever that might be. And then we can never achieve that. So we fail. We have to have accountability. So then there's the cult of confession, which is we confess our sins. We have these accountability groups. And this vicious cycle of going around and around, and we never seem to get any better. I was a part of pastoral accountability groups for years, and I failed.
Yeah.
And I always had to confess my sins.
Yeah, and you're never enough. It's never enough. You do your best, and then you screw up, or you do your best and you do great in that area, but you screw up in some other area. And it's like, God damn it, that's just the human experience. Why are we turning this into some spiritual practice that has to be met in order for you to receive salvation? I mean, it's so damaging to the psyche when you put it in those terms.
Well, we're supposed to be becoming more and more like Jesus, don't you know, Carrie Jo? That's the process of sanctification.
Sorry, brother, I confess.
It's not good enough.
Exactly.
But that's what I was told growing up, was that, listen, okay, you're on this journey. It's a lifelong process of sanctification. You are becoming slowly over your lifetime, and it's a lifetime's work, and you'll never get there, but you're going to get better, becoming more and more like Jesus. And part of that is you confess your sins and you seek forgiveness from God and from the people you've wronged. And that's all part of this journey, And yet I realize, like we said in our other podcasts on my show, how come God doesn't do a better job of helping us improve? Because I was always failing. I'm thinking, wait a minute, isn't the whole Trinity invested in helping me become a better Christian and a better person? Why am I failing and sinning and struggling all the time? That doesn't seem right.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's true for all 3 of us. We were some of the most earnest Christians that you could find. And we still
tried so
couldn't
hard.
hack it, It just,
if we couldn't make it, then who
there's
could
no hope
make
for
it?
nobody.
There's hope for no one. We're all screwed.
Well, one of the things that I started realizing that was another, just as I got older, that I started looking around, especially with the internet. We had access to so much information. Here I'd been using my just little paper Bible, and I, had all my different books and that would go along with it to try to help me understand commentaries and things like that. And then when the internet hit, it was like, oh wow, I can have access to so much more information. And then I started finding these amazing scholars that were studying, they had been studying and completely dedicated their entire adult lives mostly to trying to understand or make sense of just the New Testament, or just one book in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
And then they would all disagree on what the conclusion was. And I'm like, here I am, some just regular person trying to do my best with the tools I got. And here these guys have all the best tools at their fingertips and have for a long time, and they still can't figure it out. And that made me realize that I don't know that I want to spend my entire life to get to the end and realize that I still don't have the answer. I still can't improve enough to be what God wants me to be.
It's true. While we study Greek and Hebrew in Bible college and seminary and all that, and I can remember one time I was sitting in a class at seminary in Portland, Greek syntax, which is about as far as you can go with Greek. You study the Greek and then you get into the grammar and the textual criticism, which is basically, for those people that don't know what that's about, there's not just one manuscript of the New Testament, and there's thousands and thousands of copies and fragments and all that. And so what you do is you go in and you go, okay, what's the best reading for this particular passage out of 20 possibilities or 5 or however many, and you pick the best one. And I can remember sitting and reading this book, Greek syntax book, and I was like, okay, I'm going to figure out what the correct interpretation of this verse is because this is really important. And it said, there are 5 possible interpretations of this, and each one is equally valid. I thought, wait a minute, what does that do to my cognitive dissonance? There are 5 possible ways that you can interpret this according to the Greek grammar and all that. Nobody knows which is the correct one. So there isn't just one correct interpretation of the Bible, quote unquote, even if you study Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
It's a fool's errand. It really is.
Yeah, I discovered that too. And I remember the day that I actually heard a rabbi say that there were 70 interpretations for every verse in the Old Testament. And I was like, oh, what?
That can't be right. There's got to be one. Just give me the right one.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's a mindset within Judaism that accepts that as the norm, right? But I came from a culture of belief that no, there has to be one, right? It has to be one interpretation. How can there be 70? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I remember preaching the one time I've ever preached a sermon on the book of Ezekiel at our church when I was here in the UK, and it was kind of like a narrative sermon. That was my favorite type of preaching to do, was like storytelling. And I basically told the story of the prophet Ezekiel, but I left it open-ended. I didn't want to resolve it for people because the book is very, it's a lot of unresolved things. And as I finished, I went down and the service was over, and a guy came up to me and he's like, "So what's the answer?"
Yeah.
That was his first thing he said. "What's the answer?" I said, "What do you mean? What's the answer to you got to tell me how does this thing end? You've got to give me the answer for how this sermon concludes. What happened?" And, I said, "Well, that's the point. I wanted to make you think. You need to go home and read the book of Ezekiel. You need to study this for yourself and come up with your own conclusions." He didn't like that. He ended up going to the pastors and complaining that I hadn't solved his cognitive dissonance for him and given him the answer to the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That touches on something that I've thought a lot about in my personal experience with being very certain about every single thing that somebody could have asked me about doctrinally. I was very certain. And I look at my thought processes now and how I consider things, how I approach things. And it's with curiosity. It's with wonder. It's with, I don't know, it's like with this expectation to discover something new or a new way of seeing things or seeing it from somebody else's eyes. And it's such stark contrast to this certain, I hate to say this word because it's such a negative connotation, but it is a lazy way of operating in a faith system. Just saying, I've got the answer, bam, it's settled. I'm not going to stay open to any other concept or possibility of it being different than that. It is what it is. And it's like, wow, you really stop any kind of growth as a human when you just plant your stake and say, I'm here. It's never moving.
I'm arrived. I've arrived. This is it.
Yeah.
I'm done now. I don't have to think anymore. Well, someone said that's the beauty of fundamentalism and this kind of evangelicalism. It provides all these prepackaged answers. But of course, as you were saying before, which tradition? You want to go to the independent fundamental Baptist, they'll give you one tradition. They'll say it's King James only and all the rest of it. You go to your progressive Unitarian church down the street, you'll get a completely different answer. Universalism, there is no hell, there is no heaven, or is there a hell, is there a heaven? You'll go to a Calvinist church and get one thing. this whole thing of election and predestination, and or you go to an Arminian church and we have free will and you could lose your salvation. Who's right? Which one's right? They're all claiming to quote from the same Bible.
Yeah.
They're all reading it the same, or are they? So just pick a tradition because there's thousands of them.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And Anna and I have talked about, too, some of the freedom that we've found in our own spiritual practices now of, I kind of liken it to an a la carte situation. You know, I've got my tray. I'm choosing something from Buddhism that I really like. I'm choosing something from Hinduism that really resonates with me. And at some point I may decide, you know, I don't know about that. Maybe I've moved past that, or maybe that's not helpful anymore. And that's the beauty of it, though. Like you have freedom to explore, permission to kind of follow the little sparks of that authentic self. And I know, Clint, you have talked about this with other people on your podcast about the difference between the religious self and the authentic self. And I would love for you to touch on that a little bit for us. Like, where did you learn about this phenomenon? Because it was news to me when I heard it on your podcast. And I guess a follow-up to that would be, how would you encourage those moving through deconstruction to develop their authentic self?
Right. So there's a couple of layers to this thing. One of them is I've discovered that there's, and I hate to say it, there's two kinds of people in the world, but in a way there kind of is. And when you're talking about religion and cults and evangelicalism and all that, as we've experienced, basically, broadly speaking, okay, you've got one kind of person who was born into it. So like me, and maybe, well, I don't think either one of you were born into it, were you? But maybe you were, but born into religion or born into a cult, second, third, fourth generation, parents, grandparents, all, let's say, Christians. My parents were Christians. I was born into it. I was in church from day one. So I was like second, third generation. Then there's another kind of person who, let's say, comes to Christianity later in life. They had a previous existence before they got saved, quote unquote. And then so both of these people end up leaving the faith, but they're on a completely different journey, because people like me, I never had a quote unquote authentic self. I would say it was only ever the religious self. That's the only person I ever knew. Whereas the person who came to faith later in life, they had a previous self. So their journey is more about, when they leave the faith, they've got to go back and recover the person they were before. Mm-hmm. You know, they were a cult member or something like that. So it's a slightly different journey. For me, I would say it's a process of building, finding out who actually I am, because I never had a quote authentic self. And there's another aspect to this. I mentioned Dr. Robert J. Lifton, and he has this concept called doubling. And basically what he says is, when you're in a cult-like environment, you create an alternative self, a parallel self, a religious self that's like alongside your authentic self. So in my case, I would say, as a Christian, when I was growing up in the church, I was doubling. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was. My authentic self was there, but I never knew who that was. I had this religious self. So basically, it was a case of, I had to suppress my authentic self. So like the paradigm, like Paul talks about in the book of Romans, the sinful, the old man, the old person, I've got to put him down. I've got to suppress him for the new self, which is in Christ. That's my authentic self, is a Christian. I'm in Christ and all that. That's what it means. But now I see it as, actually, that's quite destructive and harmful. The authentic self I was putting down, I was suppressing in favor of this religious self. And when I got away from Christianity, I jettisoned the religious self. And now I'm like, okay, where's the authentic self? I've got to find that person and become who I am. So I don't know if that explains it, but that's basically been my journey, I would say, now looking back on it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. I would say my journey parallels yours in the sense that I squelched my authentic self. However, I was not raised in it. So I feel like I had a kind of authentic self to return to. But I would love to hear it for you personally. What did you find really helpful in recovering that authentic self?
Well, it's funny because there's a song by Grand Funk Railroad called Rock and Roll Soul. And when I heard that song years ago, I thought, that's me. It was rock and roll that basically saved me. I could say that for sure, because I've always been a drummer and I've always loved rock and roll music, but I was in Christian rock and metal bands when I was a good evangelical. And that was my way of saying, okay, this is something I love to do. I love to play the drums. I like rock and roll music, but I will not do secular rock. That's evil. That's of the devil. It's
Right.
satanic. We used to, I grew up during the satanic panic. So when I was in Christian high school, we used to have speakers come through and talk about the evils of rock and heavy metal and show us album covers and Ozzy Osbourne biting the head off bats and all that. So I was raised during all that in the 80s and 90s. But after I walked away from the faith, I was like, okay, this is an example of how I've become my authentic self. I can still play the drums. The physical skill hasn't changed. I'm still a drummer, but now it's rock and roll music. It's blues and all that kind of stuff. That's what I love to play. And so I think, okay, that person was always there, but I have to find out who I was. I'm not rocking for God anymore. Everything had to be about missionalizing and proselytizing. And like we talked about in our other half, every aspect of our lives was regulated by witnessing to somebody. So even putting a Christian metal band together was about spreading the gospel in bars and clubs and secular places. That's what we did, so that's part of what when I play music, my girlfriend says, oh, you've got rock and roll therapy tonight, because I go to band practice and it's like, it's so uplifting and I have so much fun and I'm connecting with who I really am. I've always been that person. But it's not about God at all anymore. It's just about having a great time, having a blast with my bandmates, playing gigs. And that's how I've recovered or discovered my authentic self in the midst of all that.
So
I can relate to that feeling, or at least for me, coming out of Christianity. I'm an artist, primarily a painter, but I also play around with other mediums. And when I came out of Christianity, even since then, I still struggle with thinking like a Christian, like judging myself or trying to figure out if this is right or wrong, or just all that kind of critical thinking that had guided so much of my life for so long. That now that I'm transitioning out of that and have been for years, I still struggle with what does it really look like for me to be authentically me.
Yeah.
And one example is through my artwork and how I express myself there, because that's a very intimate, special time for just me to be by myself. And that's when I feel like my most authentic self can come out.
Yeah.
And yet I still struggle with holding back in that time. And it's something I really want to overcome.
Yeah. You're just letting yourself go in the moment. I think that's a big part of the reconstruction piece, like you were saying, where you find those things that you absolutely love to do. And yet there's a weird aspect to all of it. Like in my case, I learned how to be a writer when I was at Bible college. I took English and composition and creative writing classes. I learned how to be an academic through that process of Bible college and seminary, doing a PhD. Obviously, I learned how to play the drums to be in worship bands and Christian rock and metal bands. But all those skills are still there. And I love doing them. I love to write. I love to play music. I love to research and I pour it into my podcast. I'll research things. I'll get into a topic and just dive in. My girlfriend said the other day, you could spend 8 hours on the computer and not even notice that the time is gone. I'm like, yeah, you're right. I could spend the whole day because I just get so into it. And like you with your art, I love to do it. And weirdly, I owe that to my Christian background. They taught me those skills. So it's not all rubbish. It's not all, you have to sift through the wreckage and pick out, like you said, take what you want, leave the rest, Carrie Jo. It's like the smorgasbord metaphor. It's not all bad. And I think we said you have to be patient with yourself because we're so angry when we leave. You just want to burn it all down. Yeah. But there's a lot of good stuff still in the wreckage, and it's like sifting through and pulling out, okay, I did learn some good skills. When I was a pastor, I learned how to deal with conflict resolution. I still use those skills to this day. Well, is that a bad thing that I learned how to be good at dealing with conflict resolution because I was a pastor? It's just a skill that you pick up.
Yeah, that's a beautiful reflection on kind of making peace with your past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are all in some way trying to do that, no matter where we're at in our deconstruction. That's
it made us the people that we are.
Yes.
You can't change the fact that I am and you two are the people that you've become because of the fact that we went through all those experiences. You can't just jettison it all and say, okay, I'm a new person now today forget all the past stuff. No, it happened. We
Right.
cannot deny the fact that it happened. We lived it. Yes, we had cringeworthy moments and all that, playing Keith Green music in the car, trying to witness to my friend, it's
Yeah.
like, oh my God. But I did
So
that.
when you mentioned that earlier, I mean, man, we listened to Keith Green so much. And I mean, on Easter morning, we
Oh,
played Keith Green. We open the windows and the doors and we blare
Yeah.
it,
Let all the neighbors hear. And then we find out he's
Yep.
kind of a cult leader. And I don't know if did you hear that episode of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast?
Didn't.
Yeah, they interviewed,
No.
I think it was one or two women who had been a part of, I think it was Last Days Ministries right before Keith Green died in the plane crash. And it's very, very cult-like environment. It's like a compound in Texas and high control and, high accountability. And,
Wow.
we're working for free because we're helping spread the gospel and killing ourselves to do all this work for God. And it's like, wow, he was running basically a cult of personality.
Wow. Yeah.
And I knew none of that. I remember when he died, went to the funeral service. It was in Seattle. Well, they did a nationwide tour. I don't know if you remember that, but second chapter of Acts, and a bunch of Christian artists. They went all around the country trying to explain why God took Keith Green home at such a shocking early way, and he died in a plane crash, and he was doing such wonderful things for God, and how could this happen? And yeah, it's all those questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever do you have songs that you used to listen to that were Christian that you ever go back to and listen to because you just loved the song?
I don't know. I mean, I was always raised on, when I did get into rock and heavy metal, I could listen to Christian music. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for bands like Stryper, Resurrection Band, Petra. I don't listen to the music anymore. In fact, I listened to a Stryper song a few months ago, and I was shocked at how fundamentalist it was and how dogmatic the lyrics were. I thought, my God, I used to listen to that and blast it from my friends, because Stryper was like the coolest band in the 80s for a Christian. They were the prototype of everything we wanted to be. They made it big on MTV. They had #1 hits and secular music, and they were proclaiming the gospel. I remember going to a Stryper concert in Seattle, and they were handing out Bibles and preaching the gospel at the end of the show. And I was like, wow, this is everything I want to be for God. I just wish I was that cool,
Yeah. We still listen to Petra. So many good songs.
Yeah,
that
I saw them so many times in concert. Resurrection Band, Petra, Daryl Mansfield. We used to go to every concert when they came to town. I mean, I was big.
We lived with the Res Band at Jesus People in Chicago.
Which is also kind of a cult experience. A lot of abuses.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, that's another.
Just a little bit.
Well, and the drummer was convicted of being a pedophile, basically, wasn't he? John Herron was a pedophile.
Yeah,
so,
we knew him.
Yeah, that was another shock.
Yeah.
All of our idols, have major feet of clay for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, thankfully, after being there for a short time, I convinced my husband that we needed to leave. I saw some of the red flags.
Yep.
And we were able to get out before we were there, had any significant trauma. But we knew lots of people that grew up there, and we still know them that have endured quite a bit.
Yep. Yeah. Communal living. I had a friend that went there for a while. He was trying to recover from drugs and alcohol, and he couldn't hack it. It was just too extreme, too, off the chain for him. And he came back when I was a pastor in Portland. And I thought, man, if this guy can't make it, who can make it? He didn't get clean of his drugs and alcohol. Why didn't God help him, though? Like we said before.
Right.
Doesn't God want you to be clean and sober?
Mm-hmm.
One would hope.
So, do you have any albums that you've put? You say you play a lot of music. Are you in any bands that we can kind of connect people to or anything?
No, because the only thing we ever did when I was in Seattle, we had a couple of bands. We put together a few demos. I have no idea if any of those are still floating around out there. But this was right during the end of the heavy metal scene, certainly in Seattle, late 80s, and then the grunge scene in the early 1990s just absolutely exploded. And it was the weirdest thing to watch and be a part of that, because when we were playing in the band that I was in, we could play 3-4 nights a week at rock bars and clubs all over Seattle. There was that many venues. When the grunge thing exploded, all that just died almost overnight. A lot of those places closed down. The scene just vanished, for rock and metal bands. And then, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Mother Love Bone, all those bands just blew up. And that was it. So our dream of being rock stars for Jesus, died when all that blew up and we gave it up. That's when I went off to Bible college in early 1990s because I thought, well, that dream's over. I'm going to be a Bible college student instead.
Yeah. Wow. What a journey. You've really experienced so much, Clint.
Well,
it's quite
not
interesting
over.
to listen to.
Yeah, that's part of why I'm over here in the UK. I've been here 18 years. I got my citizenship. I'm an expat. I'm never going back. But the ability to travel, to see new cultures. I've got Europe on my doorstep. My sister Valerie's coming over here in July, and we've got this monster trip planned. We're going to go to Brussels, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, France, Belgium, make a giant loop and see all these amazing things, So the fact that you can do that for just a few $100s really that's one of the reasons why I'm here. You've got all that history and all that stuff right on your doorstep. If you're coming from the States, it would cost, thousands and thousands to do that. And so I can hook my sister up and we can do it for super cheap.
Nice. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
You got room for one more?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I was about to say I want to do the heretical hippie question. Heretic
Yes.
or hippie.
Yes.
Yeah. And then did you have another one, Carrie Jo?
Nope.
No?
Go for it.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say thank you, Clint, for being on the show. This has been so fun, and we could probably talk for a long time. I want to just remind people to go check out your podcast, Dismantling Doctrine, formerly MindShift.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've changed the name Doctrine.
Now. Yeah. And it is a lot of fun to listen to. Clint always has really, really interesting people to talk to and really great organic conversations. And it's easy to listen to and very, very interesting. So we highly recommend it. Yeah. So I want to ask you, what makes you a heretic?
Well, yeah, by whose definition? I suppose if you're looking at me as an evangelical, then I'm definitely a heretic especially because I'm not a Christian anymore. And that's the big question is, can a Christian lose his or her salvation? And if so, then I am a prime example, as I guess all of us are, of someone who tried and found the system wanting. Were we ever Christians to begin with? Or if we were, we're apostates. We're in serious trouble. If heaven and hell are real, we're in serious trouble, and they are desperate to get us back into the fold. So yeah, that would make me a heretic for sure.
Seems like an easy answer, right?
Yeah, but that's a big question. You go on X, and now it used to be Twitter, but if you ever get into these discussions or quote whatever arguments with evangelicals, I tend to stay out of them. But I've seen people getting into it with evangelicals, and man, it's like they view us as an intellectual contagion. I think if it could happen to us, maybe it'll happen to me, so they're afraid, and yet they also want to prove somehow that we're wrong or that we were never Christians to begin with. It's a strange dynamic for sure.
It really is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear. Well, obviously, coming out of evangelicalism, we can all say that it's based on a lot of fear, that whole system. Yeah. And so when people are trying to explain away our experiences or say, oh, they never were a Christian for real, it's because they have questions. They have things that are rattling around between their ears that they can't make sense of. And if we ask those questions and landed where we are right now, that's a really scary thing for them to consider. Yeah. So I try to remember that when people kind of come at me on social media, I have to remember I am rocking their boat. And sometimes intentionally, I sometimes specifically set out to share a post that I know is going to rock somebody's boat. And I just brace myself. I know they're coming back for me, and that's okay. But I wish that had happened to me more often earlier in my Christian experience, because I think the work that the three of us are doing is so important to people who maybe are kind of on the edge. Like you said, Clint, like you're on the cliff a little bit. They're trying to decide, do I step away from this? What's at stake here? And they can see three well-adjusted people living their best lives on the other side of Christianity and high control religion. So again, thanks so much for sharing your story, your experiences, your intellect. It has been a real pleasure. And again, I want to remind everyone who's listening, if you didn't catch part 1 on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast, please go do that. And until next time.
Well, I want to know one more thing.
One more thing.
Makes you a hippie?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just having long hair and tattoos and loving rock and heavy metal, does that count? I don't know.
Yes, it does.
It does.
I'm 57 years old. I'm not going to cut my hair. I've got sleeves of tattoos and everything, so probably not going to go back. Well, I was going to say, too, if people want to come in, you two are going to be my guests in May for our Zoom call that we do once a month. So if people want more information on that, I'm sure they can contact you and find out how to get on that call. But I'm so looking forward to that. So this isn't the last conversation. We'll be meeting up again in May.
That's right.
Absolutely.
We'll look forward to that.
Especially, too, when your book comes out. Oh, my gosh. We'd love to have you on to talk about that.
I think you'll really resonate with my book. Yeah, because that was going to say how it ends is how I talk about all the sort of pedigree. It's like, was I a Christian? Well, here's all the stuff I did. You can be the judge. And all of us did all those things and more. So how can that be explained? So that's a real conundrum for evangelicals, I think.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, listener, for tuning in. We really appreciate you. If you have any questions, as always, reach out. Until next time, peace out, MFers. Well, friends, that wraps up this heretical episode. Thanks for listening, and be sure to rate and review our podcast and share with anyone who would be encouraged. See you next time.